that it took more money for Marvel to make Avengers Endgame, a substantially more amount of money for Marvel to make Avengers Endgame than it took for us to literally put a satellite on the moon.
Hi guys, welcome back to the third episode of the Fried Circuit. I'm Vyom Gupta and I'm the president of the FSA Club. And with me we have Aditya Agarwal, who's the president of the Symposium Club. Now we're going to be talking a little more about the uh, space race. And now we saw we ended the last podcast basically essentially talking about uh, the space treaty.
Right. Yeah.
Treaty.
We stopped.
What is
We
the
s- yeah. We stopped at around 68, where we were talking about. It was largely monopolized. Like we were largely talking about the space race as a function of the largest two competitors, the US and the USSR, and that kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. We're going to move from space as a government monopoly. We're going to move from away from all of that just to being a purely US USSR phenomenon, and we're going to look at space in the modern context today. So we're going to talk about companies. We're going to talk about contractors. We're going to look about like what the model is today and how it's changed from a state-driven like tool of hard power to what it is about
before we
today.
go
And I
into
think
like privatization and kind of how US companies were kind of allowed to join the space exploration kind of sector, Aditya is going to tell us a bit about two policies before that, which kind of define this sector and kind of define the field globally. One we've already talked about, and the second one is kind of the Moon Treaty, which Aditya can brief us on a
right.
bit more.
The moon treaty, I think, like most things space, was mostly symbolic. It aimed at a lot of things. It basically claimed that the moon is the symbol of like human heritage, and that it should never be weaponized. It should never be occupied. Basically, they didn't want it to become another Antarctica. But I think it's sad that it largely failed. Like barely anybody signed it. US, USSR, China, India to this date haven't signed the moon treaty. So I think even though we ended the last episode with this like on this note of wow, the outer space treaty is maybe humanity can actually settle in space and maybe it's not going to be colonization 2.0. I think the moon treaty kind of just gives us this like reality check where it's like yes, you can agree, but it's only yes, you powers can agree, but when it comes to real concrete things, we can't agree on how to settle disputes in space. For example, we've never settled or we never settled constructively how occupying the moon or maybe like colonizing the moon
So
goes.
now basically the world of space that we were kind of exploring before in the earlier episode was one which was highly monopolized. We're kind of looking at the government controlling every like it had its own branch which was NASA, and it was like it had the entire control over the entire space exploration effort. Every rocket, every satellite, all the materials, all the employees as such were kind of directly under they were sponsored by the federal budget, and they all had national objectives. This was happening all over the globe. Like this was not just in the US. This happened in the Soviet Union. It happened in Europe. It happened in India. It happened in China. And basically, what we see around this time is that companies that were had just kind of started, like they were privatizing different sectors. They were privatizing different sectors, like basically like aircraft manufacturing, like Lockheed and Boeing. They they had become suppliers of NASA. Like they started giving out uh, kind of like the materials they required to launch these kind of spacecrafts. And we this kind of set the scene where we're gonna this kind of set the scene of what was to come. And it basically happens in 1984 when Congress passed the Commercial Space Launch Act.
Basically, what Congress said in this act is a couple of things. That firstly, like the main point that American companies, for the first time ever, are allowed to build, own, and operate rockets. And this doesn't seem like a big thing, but at the time it was massive because rocket manufacturing
Yeah.
went from this thing to just limited to NASA. It became this thing that any company with a dream could do.
Okay, but
Right.
that's the funny thing, right? Like this always happens. Like when we study, if any of you are currently studying business or like economics, something related to that, we've learned one thing, that timing is very important. So at this time, there was one company called Orbital Sciences, and there were a few other smaller companies which, at the start of the CSLA, which just happened in 1984, the Commercial Space Launch Act, they immediately jumped on this opportunity, and they started like investing large amounts in R&D and like procuring investments in this field. But sadly, what happened was like something that was totally out of their control was that in 1986 there was the Challenger disaster, which I'm sure most of you all know. It was recorded. It was famously recorded, where the school teacher who was supposed to go on the trip was down on earth, luckily, and she kind of reacts. Either the school teacher or someone. She had there was a measles outbreak or something. She felt sick, and she was back on earth, and she got to see the launch, and she saw her life saved right in front of her eyes. Okay, so let me give you some backing. The space shuttle was this kind of half reusable, the most famous rocket actually. It looks like an aircraft mounted on top of like rockets. It's
Yeah.
really cool. And the government kind of started this outreach program where they were taking people from normal professions, like they were taking teachers, doctors, and sending them off into space. And she was elected, and she was supposed to go to space. And sadly, there was like some measles outbreak, or there was some kind of outbreak in her school, and she was unable to go, but she still wanted to see the launch. So she went there, and her reaction was recorded on live TV, which is very eerie and very cool. But yeah, sadly, because of this, there was a massive policy shift. Because imagine NASA was not able to like protect the lives of the people they were sending into space. They couldn't trust private players immediately at that time, and because of that, many uh, companies kind of
Yes, I
suffered.
think this is something that's a recurring trend in like humanity, that uh, you found this really cool innovation, you found something that's actually path breaking, and this one event happens which everybody goes like, wait a minute, this might not be safe, this might we might not be going at a fast pace. And I think this is kind of a double-edged sword, because the price you pay for innovation at that point is like risk, and in this time obviously it was justified, because the risk was human life, and obviously that's not a price that we're willing to pay. But just generally, many times in history, like even though innovation could have been rapid, people have always been like, this is not the right time, or you like innovation needs to slow down. And I think this is some sort of human trait of like clinging on to older innovation because we don't deal well with change or
I
something.
like to quote something right now that most of the time, kind of technology plays on the whim of human emotion, which is really cool. I feel that statement is so true. And like most of you all people watching this episode, I feel that you have to understand that maybe you'll go on and become great scientists and find the next groundbreaking invention. I really hope you do. But it might not work out at that particular given time just because of general human sentiment, and that's nothing that's in your control. And this also actually happened with the Concorde, which was the most groundbreaking kind of invention at its time, getting people across the Atlantic in 2 hours, traveling at Mach 2. But sadly, because of the like, there were incidents with it, there were significant problems, but the major event that kind of led to its downfall was the Air France crash. And that's kind of also kind of shows us that how certain events are out of the reach of technology, out of the reach of so many things, but kind of halts invention and kind of halts growth. But luckily for space travel, its path, it was destined to come back again. And even though there was the Challenger disaster and commercial flight was halted, they allowed these companies to kind of send payloads of satellites. Like they weren't allowed to carry people into space, but they were allowed to send these kind of satellites into space. And jumping a little ahead from 1986, what happens in 1998 after the shock of the Challenger disaster kind of settles down, is that there was a Commercial Space Act, which then again kind of allowed these private players to not just launch satellites and these kind of like not rovers, but like all of these kind of uh, artificial mechanics into the air, like into space, but they were also allowed to like send also they were like they were allowed to supply to the ISS, they were allowed to send goods, and they were also now allowed to like send humans into space.
Right. And I think this is really important, because even though we skip like 12 years in history, this reflects what we were talking about. This is 12 years of growth that could have occurred, but it slowed down because of the Challenger disaster, and something that could have happened 2 years later we see happening 12 years. But 12 years later. But I think, like Vyom said, coming back to this Commercial Space Act, it was like most of these bills, most of the United States government's efforts to bring the space race back into public, back into like public information and back into the public highlight. The Commercial Space Act actually did a pretty good job of it because it took satellites. It took the role of private companies not just to launch satellites, but it made it everything space related. So it became Earth observation, it became like satellite coverage. It also expanded some level of reconnaissance that even private satellites could do. And I think that's really interesting because the US government expanded access as official partnerships and expanded its access of official partnerships, not just to other countries, but also private actors. Right?
Yeah. And we kind of look at this time, 1998, and then just 4 years later, we have a boy from South Africa who kind of moved to Canada, and then he moved to the US, and his name is Elon Musk. And he kind of jumped onto this opportunity. He said, wow, this is something I feel I can make great money off. And he founded SpaceX. And the funny thing is, there were companies before him, like Orbital Sciences and like these other companies. But sadly, because of the circumstances of those times, they weren't able to succeed. And that's why most of the time people contribute uh, successes of companies also to timing. His timing was perfect. Other than that, one insane thing that Elon Musk did was that at during this Commercial Space Act in 1998, people laughed at it, like honestly, because if you looked at the cost of procuring a rocket in the US, even the ultra millionaires and billionaires were finding it hard to finance. It was ultra high risk, and there didn't seem to be much of a reward. But Elon Musk kind of viewed it differently. He first went to Russia. Like this is a very famous story. He went to Russia. He tried to procure the rockets. He tried to lower the cost, but that did not like work out. But eventually he came back to the US and he started making his own rockets for a much like cheaper price. And he kind of efficiently lowered the price. He lowered the barrier of entry for his company and kind of broke this thing which was, even though it was privatized and like even though it was privatized, it was kind of a monopoly. He was able to kind of break it, and he was like one of these pioneering people who broke this high barrier, entered the industry, and was like off to like change the way people started looking at
Right.
space.
Yeah, I want to know two things in the rise of SpaceX under Elon Musk, and that firstly, like we told you in the last episode when we were ending, that the space race actually has so much potential. And we look at Elon Musk in the last 6 years. I think when SpaceX finally started to get somewhere, and we were like, wow, this guy is so lucky. He's at the forefront of innovation. He's at the forefront of probably what the future has to hold. But a lot of people forget like the 20 years of groundwork he had to do, the kind of vision he had to have in 2002 to be like to, and think about this in the historical context, right? In 2000, the dot-com bubble crash just happened. So people were still excited about things like websites and just the general idea of the internet. For a man to have the kind of vision in 2002 to be like commercial commercial flights into space and just generally the space industry is going to be like the future of making money. I think that's actually something that is very noteworthy, right? And the second thing to note is that like View was talking about the fact that the rise of SpaceX actually first of all reduced the barriers to entry in the commercial industry and just generally in the space sector in the US. But it also actually pushed NASA to develop this really, really famous program. It's called the Commercial Orbital Transportation Service. And essentially, because SpaceX in 2008 started offering private flight through the Falcon 1, NASA actually had to respond because it's like the perception that a private company can go further than the United States government was obviously something the US was not okay with. And we are going to talk about the implications of that.
Yeah, so basically, just because of that, NASA kind of doubled down on its commercial crew program, and it was very interesting because earlier we were kind of looking at a space race between governments. For the first time, we kind of we started seeing a space race between a government and a private industry, which was something very interesting. And uh, what we basically started seeing was that the private industry was winning, and it was kind of peak capitalism. We started seeing private industries purely dominating over this government sector because just just that kind of reflects the full idea of capitalism, right? Like they had better thought, they had better idea, and they kind of uh, they were able to incentivize their labor to work more efficiently. They were able to procure better equipment. They were able to do everything much better than the government. And other than that, what they basically did was they also found a way to get the rockets to land again, which was cutting costs by an insane amount. And it was kind of that was the essential main idea that led SpaceX to cut costs so heavily and to like kind of end up winning this race as to a point where the US government where the US government like NASA had to approach SpaceX and payloads up there. So we kind of see this dominance of SpaceX. And we also see another very interesting thing, which is kind of the space race of private industries. Because now we can see the US kind of sinking and fading into the background, kind of accepting the fact that industries are doing much better than them and letting the private industries rule the game. And we can see like companies like Virgin Atlantic with Richard Branson, and he's also attempting to go into space, and then most famously Jeff Bezos with his start of Blue Origin. And we're entering this now, this very uncharted domain of private space race, which can be very interesting because now you're not looking at kind of governments and who are like misallocating resources. You're looking at single individuals who kind of have big, large portfolios of money, and they're investing in different kind of companies. That gives them more flexibility to choose how much they want to invest in these kind of space programs. So we're going to see very rapid development in the next few years, which is something I'm very excited to see, honestly.
Right. And I think like what Vyom really drove home was the fact that this really was peak capitalism at play. That we saw like, a guy from South Africa, he could push NASA to do things that it wouldn't have done unless it was for his company. And this is at a time where like companies were Blue Origin and things were not that relevant. It was literally just SpaceX versus NASA. And I think that's really, really cool. But also the US actually further doubled down on this action of incentivizing the on incentivizing private companies because they saw the model and they were like, this is working great. We're getting two players that are actually doing pretty well. So in 2015, they launched the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act. And essentially what it did is that even though the Moon Treaty wasn't signed, this act 10 years back said that private companies in the United States can actually like harvest resources of the moon. And I think that's extremely funny because it just comments on how capitalistic us humans can be. Because this is at a time where forget about like even knowing what kind of resources on the moon. Like we haven't even able to get like a resource harvested on the moon. And human society is already dividing up who can access resources and who can harvest them. And I think that's just really, really funny. But yeah, I mean, coming back to today, like we said, we have over 400 companies operating just in the United States space sector. We have SpaceX, Blue Origin, Rocket Lab, a bunch of those companies. And the US has transitioned today from what we saw in our last episode to a total government monopoly to a literal open dynamic market powered by legal reforms, there's public-private partnerships, and just pure entrepreneurial ambition.
I feel that's a wonderful thing you've brought on because like we're just gonna take a small detour and just talk a little more about this because when we're starting looking at space kind of become this open market. Do you feel there'll be do you feel there'll be a time where the barriers are so low that many players start entering? Like we saw this with the aircraft industry. It was a new hot thing in the 1960s, 1950s, but that was purely owned and governed by governments who were kind of running their own aircrafts and their own airlines. And then we see these private players entering and kind of dominating the scene. And then they start offering cheaper fares continuously, kind of outpacing each other, breaking through and finding new ways in the industry until like air flying is kind of accessible to everyone. Like right now, like everyone, I feel who's making like a decent income is able to would choose to take an aircraft and fly to their hometown in India itself rather than traveling by train. So, do you feel that could happen with the space industry also?
Right. I think it can definitely happen with the space industry because, like you said, just this is something that happens with all great innovation. If this happened with airplanes, this is and like we emphasized in the last episode, the space race, which is generally space exploration, is not reached its peak. Like there is a lot of work to be done. Uh, I think that yeah, definitely. Like when I look at the future of space exploration with my limited knowledge, with my limited research, this definitely seems like an exciting opportunity.
And in
Do you?
fact, oh,
Yeah,
that's another very interesting thing. Like when we saw airplanes become a very big thing, especially with transatlantic travel, we could basically see that like ships like that, like I'm gonna say Titanic because like of its known popularity, but those kind of like cruisers that would cruises that would travel from like London to New York were kind of the basically from Europe to the US were kind of the main form of transportation, and people would not even think about taking a flight. And then essentially what happened was that flights became all the rage, and they became cheaper, and they became more efficient. And then we see these ships kind of changing their model. They had to start adapting to the new kind of environment, and they started like advertising themselves as these kind of boutique, unique experiences rather than actual form of transportation. Do you feel that could also happen to the aviation sector, where people are traveling by rockets rather than airplanes, and airplanes just becomes a cool way of traversing the sky rather than actual transportation?
I mean, yeah, like human travel is actually the best example of how innovation can progress. Like from the wheel to the horse cart to the car to the railways to this like to ships, like you said, airplanes. I think this is definitely not the end. I think first of all in terms of speed, second in terms of efficiency, maybe even in terms of economic efficiency. I think space might be the answer in terms of travel efficiency, maybe not even just intraplanet. I think before we end, it's like we touched upon Skyroot, we touched upon some of the work that is happening in India, and I think we should really just
Yeah.
discuss the Indian space story. Uh, like how ISRO from a monopoly, it's now India, Bangalore, Hyderabad. These are all hubs for not just regular startups, but actually startups with a vision that Elon Musk had in 2002 to do something with the space sector.
So actually, India has a very interesting like relationship with space. We are kind of seen as the most efficient kind of cheapest way to get to space, and that's exactly what Elon Musk copied. He copy pasted the Indian method of getting people to space. We got the most number of satellites into space in one launch before Elon Musk broke that record, and I feel India is looking at the correct way of entering space. And if private kind of companies kind of copy this method of using cheaper methods of getting large payloads into space, we could be ruling this industry, especially for Indians being known of being like thrifty and kind of finding new inventions and new ways of approaching a problem. We can really be dominating this field, especially in the commercial aspect. I don't feel we're that advanced where we're kind of looking at sending people off right now with the Gaganyaan missions and all. I feel that's a bit in the long run, but we can be the dominating factor of sending like these kind of satellites, like how we look at SpaceX's Skynet program. We can be dominating in telecom and like helping the agricultural industry in a major way. And I'm very excited to see what's happening in all of these hubs like Hyderabad and Bangalore, especially with the brightest minds working with these new startups like Skyroot. And I feel we can really be reaching into the stars here.
I think just to drive home the point of efficiency and how affordable India really is, there was this really funny fact that was popularized at the time after the Chandrayaan mission became successful, that it took more money for Marvel to make Avengers Endgame, a substantially more amount of money for Marvel to make Avengers Endgame than it took for us to literally put a satellite on the moon. And this just really puts things into perspective, because a superhero movie, sure, it was a great movie, I love Avengers, but a superhero movie took more money than like India putting a satellite on the moon that was used for critical research, that was just had so many implications. And that tells and the US equivalent of putting something on the moon is, I can't even explain how many times more it is. It puts things into perspective of the promise that the Indian space sector holds. And this is not just us as Indians thinking that India can actually do something, but the hard numbers tell us that India actually has an opportunity, and it's up to the leaders of tomorrow, and it's up to the scientists of tomorrow to decide if they're going to use that opportunity well.
Yeah, I feel you kind of perfectly summarized that topic. And we can now quick I think we can go into just a bit about the general future, not of India, but of the world in terms of space travel. And I was actually kind of thinking about something. What do you feel the major goal of space exploration is? Do we have to harvest resources? Is that what we're going to try to do with space exploration? Or is it about Elon Musk's great plan of kind of sending people out and have like becoming a type 1 civilization or type 2 civilization where we're kind of settling along all these kind of different planets in the solar system? Or is it for like intra planet transportation? What is the first step ahead economically viable step ahead in space exploration right now?
I think I've thought about this actually before. I've had a lot of conversations with my brother about this. But I think there are four things to note in terms of why do we like do space race? Why the space race? Like why space expedition? What is the future of space expedition? I think firstly there is a lot of symbolic importance. We've talked about this a lot already on our podcast. Just the idea of humanity that has been
Sure.
limited to
Yeah,
this planet for so
we
long,
can
right?
park that topic here.
Yeah, second I think is about just in I think technology, things like Starlink, things like military reconnaissance, things like intelligence gathering. I think the space like I think putting satellites in space has a lot of important technology implications. Then thirdly, like you said, planet but like sorry like you said, like, traveling intraplanet maybe, but mostly just like traveling for leisure. I think like millionaires have shown. I think recently Katy Perry went to space, and I think it was just like it epitomized how popularized space travel can be, because I I think it was an all women trip that went to space,
Yeah.
and it was like it was saying that this is going to be the norm, and in the future the space travel is actually going to be a normal thing. So that was definitely really cool, traveling for leisure. And fourthly, we've been discussing the future, like the overarching future, and that might be hopefully advancing to more advanced species, like maybe a type
And
2
other
species.
than that, what I was thinking of is basically, do you feel that the US will need to change its laws? So currently, what the US or the government is kind of saying, or the recent act passed on this topic is that they can private companies are allowed to take resources from space and keep it for themselves. But I was doing like some studies on this, and I saw that the meteorites in our solar system, which have large amount of resources, like very valuable resources, which if extracted could change the net worth of certain people, especially like Elon Musk, who's currently like he's not doing this in particular, who could potentially be doing something like this and kind of ruin the full economic system like ballistically.
This is a really hard question to answer, because at surface level, like definitely no man should have this kind of power. But the only reason we've got this far in space exploration, and the only reason we all think there's so much promise, is because the government has obligations. Like it needs to feed its people, it needs to provide education, it needs to provide shelter. But companies don't. Like companies operate on a for-profit level, and companies operate because they see promise. So the government can't do things and be like, moon is the future, let me allocate 80% of the budget into harvesting the moon and sending people to Mars. But a company with a vision and strong leadership can do that. So it's easy for me to say that no company should not be given so much power. But the only reason like billions of dollars are being poured in by VCs and private equities into companies that have this vision is because they operate in a for-profit model, and they can take the kind of risk towards space exploration that governments can never justify to their
Yeah,
constituents.
I absolutely, yeah, I love your answer. But I was, I'm kind of hinting towards the fact that after it is extracted, like we saw what happened with Rockefeller. Basically, after he did everything that he had to, the government just came in like last minute and kind of broke down his empire. Do you feel something like that will be required to be done in the future?
In the future,
Like,
definitely
I
we
totally
know.
agree. The government can't interfere right now because it'll just like hamper progress. But sometime in the future, do you think the government will have to just come in, step in, and take away the resources?
I mean, with all things resources, like the Sherman Antitrust Act, like it had to break up Standard Oil, like that had to happen. But that's after Standard Oil ran its course, after it revolutionized the field, after everything happened. So like you said, it can't happen now. But if it happens where there's like Rockefeller 2.0 and he has crazy access to minerals because of meteorites, obviously then breakups need to happen. Like competitive markets need to exist. But at the time, I think we're at this really sweet spot where governments are operating at a level where they're trying to have their own national development, but there's also companies that are really incentivized to explore space. And I think that's exactly what we need for the future.
I feel you answered that perfectly. I'm really satisfied with that answer. To sum up everything we've talked about right now is we have basically looked at how we the space industry has transformed from this really public controlled government controlled entity to now a private. sector, and Aditya is just gonna run us through the final
Right.
thoughts.
Like we saw how the US led the way. Like it turned government monopoly into a competitive ecosystem that's now launching people and payloads at record pace into space. And we've also seen that India under like a long before it was ISRO centric, but now startup centric and people with vision centric is rapidly catching up too because of its affordability with policy reforms that are creating a startup revolution that I think might rival Silicon Valley. So the barriers to entry are falling, and space, I think, will always reward those who can innovate, collaborate, and solve the hardest problems that today are problems. But I think those who can solve it, it will be extremely, extremely rewarding for them. I think, and both Vyom and I sincerely think this, that the next decade will see new nations, new companies, and new uses for space technology. And space, in my eyes, is the final frontier. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next episode.
Bye. Oh, please like, share, and subscribe.
Yeah, please do that.